Dear listeners, this is the third part of this story. If you haven't seen the previous parts, we recommend you watch them first. At 11 o'clock sharp, we arrived at the lawyer's office. Upon entering, I saw a young blonde girl with striking features. It was clear that she was Jean, my father's last wife. Well, everyone's here. Can we start? Jean fidgeted impatiently in her chair. From the wall, an unassuming man in a gray suit stepped forward. We have to wait a little longer. Not everyone is here. He coughed and cleaned his glasses, squinting his myopic eyes. I understood that he was the notary. Shouldn't someone else come up? John looked around the room with her eyes. As far as I know, there are 3 heirs. Alas, there's one more heir, the notary smiled wryly. We cannot open the will without his presence. I immediately realized that he was not as simple as he wanted to seem. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman in a strict business suit and chic hat entered the office. I even felt the notary's sigh of relief. This is Mrs. Violet Beaumont, Ivan's first wife. He bent down in a half bow and pushed back his chair, inviting the lady to sit down. Now everyone is assembled and we can begin. I sat and looked at the woman in silence. So this is my mother. After all these years, she came to share her ex-husband's inheritance? So this was the surprise the lawyer was telling me about. Thoughts raced through my head at breakneck speed. I had so many questions that my brain was unable to make sense of the emotions that were rushing in. But I tried to pull myself together. Elena and Jean were also perplexed, looking from me to my mother. Only Mrs. Beaumont seemed to remain unperturbed. She nodded imposingly to the notary and the lawyer. What are we waiting for, gentlemen? Let's get on with it, she pronounced without paying the slightest attention to me. The notary took a folder out of his briefcase and began, Gentlemen heirs, the will was made by the late Ivan a month before his death. He read the preamble and got to the essence of the will, all the movable and immovable property belonging to me, then went on listing all that belonged to my father. I leave to my last wife, Jean. I could hear Jean even squeak in happiness. I leave the sum of $5,000 in my bank account to Violet, Beaumont, and Elena in equal shares of $2,500 each. My son Yuri I disinherit. Next came the enumeration of the officials in whose presence the will was made. There was a pause. From a lousy sheep, at least a speck of wool, my mother said angrily, and left the room without so much as a glance at me. The others came up. Jean did not hide his joy, victoriously looking at me and Lena. One moment, gentlemen. The lawyer took the floor. There are some more nuances. He opened the file in front of him. The fact is that 6 months ago, Mr. Ivan gave his property, including the construction company, to Elena. If Jean would object and try to challenge this decision in court, he asked her to betray it. The lawyer handed Jean an envelope of photographs. Jean snatched it from the lawyer's hands and began to examine the contents. You could see by her face that she was in shock. One photo fell out of her hands and rustled to the floor. I managed to see that it showed a half-naked Jean in the arms of some swarthy macho man. I caught Lena's cold and somehow lifelessly detached look. She, without saying a word, quickly left the lawyer's office, and I didn't even have time to congratulate her on the unexpected wealth that had fallen on her head. I thought she was waiting for me at the front door, but she wasn't there either. Strange. What made Lena disappear so quickly without a word to me? Maybe I thought too much of myself. After just one night? Maybe she wasn't alone for 4 years. Well, I didn't expect much, so my father's decision didn't put me in despair. I have my arms and legs and my health for now. I used to live without a lot of money, and I will continue to do so. Life is a strange thing. It changes people before our eyes. Just yesterday, I had a woman with me whom I seemed to love with all my heart. And now, by the will of fate, becoming a rich lady, she coldly abandoned me, threw me away like a used pad. Even Jean felt some sympathy for me. Come, let's have a drink, get some fresh air, let's celebrate, so to speak, she smirked bitterly. I declined, and in the evening my mother came to see me. She stood on the poorly lit stairwell and looked at me. The same wide-brimmed hat was covering her face, so I couldn't see the expression in her eyes. May I come in? She asked in a slightly husky voice. I stepped aside. She took off her boots, hung her coat and hat on the coat rack, and went into the room. Is this your apartment? My mother asked or stated, glancing around the modestly furnished living room. Yes, my grandmother left it to me. I was surprised that my mother's visit didn't stir up any emotions in me. But I don't live here. Where do you live? My mother asked me. I am a military man. I live in a military unit, in an officer's dormitory. Are you married? I got divorced recently. Why? It seemed that my mother even looked at me with some interest. I remained silent. For some reason, our conversation reminded me of a conversation before I was hired. Short questions and short answers. I understand that you can't feel anything but hatred towards me. But believe me, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about you. Your father was a terrible man. I only endured that hell for 1.5 years. Yes, I left you very young, but believe me, I had no other choice. My mother pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, wiping away her tears. There was a pause. Mother sobbed a few times. She sounded like she was really crying. I was very surprised when my lawyer called me and invited me to the reading of the will. I hadn't had any relationship with Ivan since I left. And now suddenly a will and money. She smiled sadly. Yura, you don't know everything. Before I got married, I dated a guy. His name was Sergey. We were getting ready to get married. We had already bought rings, but then Ivan intervened. I do not know how he persuaded or maybe forced Sergey to give me up. And my lover left me, not knowing I was pregnant. A month later, I married Ivan, and 8 months later, I gave birth to you. God, how happy I was then. For almost 1.5 years, we lived normally, and then Ivan started to look at you, trying to find a resemblance to himself. He got the idea that you weren't his son. He took a DNA test and it all came out. That night, he beat me up. He screamed that I was a bitch, a whore, a slut. Ivan took all my jewelry, even my wedding ring. He beat me almost every day, and I couldn't take it anymore. One day when he was at work, I kissed you one last time and left. I couldn't take you with me because I had nowhere to go. I had some money, so I bought a ticket and went to the capital. I had an aunt living there. I could hardly find her, and I begged her on my knees not to throw me out on the street. She took pity on me and let me live. She got me a job as a waitress in a cafe. That's where I met Act. He was studying and was taking his final exams that year. Ahmed began to woo me. They know how to turn naive fools' heads. He promised to marry me and offered to go to his parents in Egypt. I agreed, bitten by his tales of the beautiful life. But instead of meeting my parents and getting married, I ended up in a brothel. My mother covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. For 3 years I had been in hell. I accepted my fate as payback for abandoning my child. I worked all day long on sheets soaked with sweat, unable even to wash. Once a day, a bucket of water was brought to the little pencil box, fenced off with blankets so that I could wash a little. And then it went on again. It was the German Peter Bermont who got me out of there. I don't know how he managed to buy me out of slavery. He took me to Germany. He offered to take me back home. But I flatly refused. I was afraid I'd ruin your life. A few years later, I married Peter, but we had no children. The years I spent in a brothel and the several abortions I had. After almost 10 years, I came to our town. I saw you. What did I have to do to keep from running up to you, to hold you against my chest? But I was afraid of hurting you, so I watched you from the sidelines. I secretly met with your grandmother, betrayed her trust, and begged her not to tell anyone that I was here. And then you left, and I lost you. Today when I saw you, my heart was pounding so hard. I thought everyone could hear it pounding. I know you could never forgive me, but I had to tell you all this. Where is your husband now? I poured a glass of water and gave it to my mother. He passed away 1 year ago. I live alone now. He has grown-up children. They are good to me. They even come to visit. I went to the window. Everything became clear to me. Ivan was not my father. That's why he treated me so coldly. And in the end, he disinherited me. My mother stood up. She took a bag out of her purse and put it on the coffee table. There's money in it. Please take it. I looked at her silently, trying to look into her eyes. She cringed and went into the hallway. I did not go to see her off. After getting dressed, my mother looked into the room. Forgive me, son. She whispered these words almost silently and went to the front door. Had I forgiven her? To be honest, I did not know myself. One thing was clear to me. I loved her all the time, though I could never remember her face. And then something snapped inside me. I suddenly felt like that little boy again. The one my mother had once left me. Mother. It was hard for me to speak. Spasms were choking me by the throat. Tears streamed from my eyes until my mother's warm native hand pressed my head to her chest. I did not care about the world, because my mother was with me. Already in early January, the thaw was replaced by real frosts. It snowed lightly at night, and in the morning the sidewalks and trees seemed to be sprinkled with powdered sugar. The dim winter sun splashed lazily in the puddles covered with a thin film of ice. Its light was shaky and uncomfortable. Looking at this light, one wished that night would come quickly. But even in the darkness, it did not become easier. As if reluctantly, the street lamps cast a liquid, rattling light over the night streets, making people even more melancholy and hopeless. Night is the time when evil awakens, when spirits and ghosts roam the world. It is the time when one feels the fear of death most acutely. I approached a 2-story mansion, lost in the depths of an ancient park. Careful not to slip, I climbed the frost-covered steps. It was quite early, and the janitor had not yet had time to clean them and sprinkle them with sand and salt. I barely made it up to the porch as the door swung open, as if it was waiting for me. "What do you want?" A sleepy maid inquired grudgingly, pressing her hand to her mouth to conceal a yawn. "Good morning. I am looking for Helena. The mistress is still asleep and has told me not to disturb her." "Tell the mistress that Yuri wants to see her." Without uttering a word, the maid shut the door in my face. "Well, let's wait." I smoked, inhaling deeply the cigarette smoke along with the frosty air. The door opened again. It was the same maid. The landlady said she doesn't know anyone by that name. "Go away or I'll call the guards." I thought I saw the figure of a half-dressed young man behind the girl. Well, I already knew how easily and thoughtlessly cruel women can be. Yesterday she was still in love, but today the situation has changed, and she has stepped over me. One should never cling to the past. And at that moment my cell phone rang. "Yuri, my name is Combat, and I have a proposition for you. Be there today at 7 p.m. in the restaurant at the Plaza Hotel. I know you, so I'll come myself." Dear listeners, please like and subscribe to our channel. It stimulates me to release new videos for you.